All right, let's get this thing going here. And welcome everybody to our podcast. Turn this thing off. There we go. So we just want to we won't take the normal time, like an hour and 15, I don't think, here. But today I want to talk to you about proposed church manual changes. We have the church manual. We have a general conference session coming up in July, early July here of 2025, and each time we have a GC session, they change the church manual. There's modifications. A lot of people I know. This is not. I'm not going to make the case for the church manual. I've made it in other places. A lot of people are very negative about it, and yet it actually is one of the things that we have that does the most to prevent abuse of authority in the church. And it's one of those things that kind of outlines the rights of members, and more so, it seems to me, some of the obligations the church has towards its members. And so we want this. We want this. Everything should be done decently in order. 1 Corinthians 14. And when we apply that to the way the church works, we want clear lines. What happens is, even though there are abuses, there always are abuses of the Constitution, of the lawmaking powers of the United States, of different nations, and there are in the churches. There are abuses of power in times when some of the obligations the church has towards you, the members, are not followed. Nevertheless, though, to have something written out, specified, this is the way we do church discipline, this is the way we do this is what we believe, that's actually a very good thing. And so what I want to do today is focus on one thing in particular, and I want to back out from that and expand and look at some issues in terms of how the church works, how it should work, and the most ideal things we can do. We're going to look at some American history because we have separation of powers in the United States. And in many ways, the church is kind of an echo, the way the church is organized. We look at kind of an echo of that. But whoops, didn't mean to take that away. All right, here we go. Let's go ahead and so we have this proposed change on page 35 of the church manual. There's a section in there on pastors and so on. And this section on page 35 of the current manual would be more or less taken away. No one should be allowed to speak to any congregation unless he or she has been invited by the church in harmony with guidelines given by the conference It is recognized, however, that there are times when congregations may be addressed by government officials or civic leaders, but all unauthorized persons shall not be given access to the pulpit. So they're talking about removing this, and a lot of this goes back a couple of years to some abuses we had when an ordained minister of good repute was banned from speaking in a conference near Washington, D.C. But now here's what we have here is we have page 35, which will be that some of the more troubling pieces there would be taken away. But that would leave, apparently, based on the released agenda for the potential changes, would leave the current language on page 126. So I've got that language on 2 slides here. And I think you'll notice here that it's kind of like either is page 35 a redundancy, because in page 126, we have really the same stuff. If you take it away on 35 and you leave it on 126, you've got a problem. So I would suggest that for reasons that I'll give further on in our discussion here, I would suggest that we also take it that the language, the general conference session be, delegates be firm and determined to also remove some of the language on page 126. So let's look at this language on page 126. Only speakers worthy of confidence will be invited to the pulpit by the local church pastor in harmony with the guidelines given by the conference. The local elders or church board may also invite speakers in consultation with the pastor and in harmony with conference guidelines. Individuals who are no longer members or who are under discipline should not be given access to the pulpit. At times, it is acceptable for government officials or civic leaders to address a congregation, but all others should be excluded from the pulpit unless permission is granted by the conference. Every pastor, elder, and conference president must enforce this rule. So we have this segment, and let's zero in just a little bit on what this requires. Actually, let's come back to this. Let's go back. Let's go over here to the fact that in the church we have segmented hierarchy. It's somewhat like, again, the United States government in certain respects. Different sections, and it's not like a pyramid, and you go up further and further, and there's more and more power, and you get to the Pope at the top, like the papacy more or less gives the maximum authority to the one guy on top, and it comes down from him. In the church, we believe and it's stated in the church manual, that the authority rests in the membership. So the authority actually goes up from the members. It is then delegated to conferences, from conference constituencies to conference administrators that are elected, and they serve a certain period of time, and it goes on up through the conferences to the unions, to the division, and the general conference. So I want you to notice that there are things that the authority does not just go up in the church. You have different sections of the church have different things are determined by them. For example, who is ordained? That's determined by the union. The conference will submit a request. We believe that Brother X should be ordained, and so we're asking you to do this. The union kind of looks at it, confirms it, and allows it, and that kind of approves that. So the conference doesn't determine its own arrangement. Discipline in the church. Discipline in the Seventh-day Adventist Church is determined, and same in Protestantism, in most cases. Discipline is determined by the local church. It's not determined by the conference officers. It's not determined by the union or some cardinal further up the line or the Pope or something like that. Discipline is handled strictly on a local church basis. So your fellow members that know you the best because you're a member in that local congregation, they are the ones who would potentially place you under church discipline or even remove you from membership. They're the ones who would hear your case, hear the evidence in your case. I mean, I know a lot of churches don't really even do church trials anymore, but unfortunately, it is necessary from time to time to do that. So that's happening at the local church. It's not handled at the conference level or the union level or some other level. It's handled at the local church. Church discipline is a local church matter only. Then you have global beliefs, and we have a list of 28, I believe, beliefs at this time that we decide are not the only beliefs there are, but those are the beliefs that the world church says the whole global church is going to assent to those beliefs, approve those, be teaching those beliefs, and those are determined only by the general conference in session. Those are not determined by some distant committee. They're not determined by a committee of officers at the general conference that get together and say, oh, we're going to say we believe this. We have an issue right now in the church with certain statements that have been created at different times that have not been voted on by the delegates from the entire church body. But at each general conference session, if you're not familiar with that, generally speaking, every 5 years or so, we have a general conference session. Delegates, we have 23, 24 million members all around the world. Delegates are voted and appointed, and they come all together, whether it's in the United States or in some other place. We come together in one location. There will be 2,000, 2,500, 1,800 delegates, some amount, and they come from Africa, different countries in Africa. America gets a certain amount. Each country gets a certain amount, and then those delegates actually vote, and we believe that we're led by the Holy Spirit. They make decisions, they deliberate, and we wind up to a conclusion. So the only way we can get beliefs sorted out is the world church must approve it. And that way we kind of we have things all the way from the authority that rests in the membership all the way to the top administrative authority, the president of the general conference. All is only approved if the world church approves it. So we have here three examples, and we could give several others, examples of distinct authorities that are assigned to different parts of the organizational structure. In the United States government, again, you have three branches: the executive branch, you have the legislative branch, and you have the judicial branch. And each one has different authorities to decide this and that. And so there's a separation of powers. Within the church, there is also a separation of powers. So one part of the Congress works on the budget. The president, he signs bills into law, but he can't make law, but he can sign them or he can veto them. And with a certain ratio, sometimes the president can be overruled if Congress goes through the proper procedure. They can actually overrule, and even if the president vetoes something. So there's checks, we call them checks and balances. There is no perfect system of human governance, and so the church is the same way. There is no perfect system of church governance, and so we have, again, a separation of powers, similar in many respects, not every respect, but similar in many respects to the United States government. So the church has segmented hierarchy. It's not just the president can do whatever he wants, and then the next guys down can do almost whatever they want, and the next guys down can do some of the things they want, and the lowest amount of authorities at the bottom. No, the main authority, again, we've talked about this before, right? All authority, Jesus, Matthew 28, all authority is given to Jesus. Some of his authority he gives to his church. And we believe that comes into all the members. And then all the members constitute the constituency. They are the body of believers in a given state or location. We call that usually a conference. And so the conference then elects delegates, and they meet every now and again, usually every 4 years or 5 years apart. Really should be meeting every 2 years or 3 years apart because the world is changing so rapidly. I'm waiting for some conference to really change that, so that they're meeting like the early Seventh-day Adventist Church did. They met at first yearly for general conference. Then they met every 2 years. And because the world is changing so rapidly right under our feet, we really need to spend more money to have more of these meetings and have more, a tighter control, a tighter help, and more accountability on the leaders to help them lead in these extraordinary times. So the church has segmented hierarchy, and different parts of the church determine different things. Not every part, so it's not one part as everything goes up higher and higher and has more authority. So hopefully you get the point here. So let me come back to that here. So let's go back to this changes. So I was saying to you at the beginning here that this change on page 35, that they want to take most of this out here, would leave this material on these two slides for page 126. And you actually have cases today where we have unions. So again, maybe I need to clarify the structure for some who might be listening. Let me just take one moment to clarify the structure here. So what we have here in the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the individual is the smallest unit. Individuals are part of congregations or local churches. A group of local churches or a sisterhood of churches combine together and they become a conference. So for example, I am laboring here. I've been called to serve here in Michigan. So I'm part of the Michigan Conference. The Michigan Conference has, I forget how many churches we have here all across the state of Michigan. So there's X number of churches across the state of Michigan, we constitute one conference. Okay, and so then conferences are combined in a union, usually of 5 or 6 different conferences. So a lot of times it's by state. Sometimes there's groupings that overlap in different ways, but so we have Michigan conference. We're connected with some of the other. Illinois is a conference. Indiana is one of the conferences. So what we have is a grouping, and that grouping constitutes the union. And then we have 59 unions in North America that combine together, America and Canada, and that creates what's called the North American Division, which is kind of the front office of the General Conference. There's 13 world divisions. The General Conference is the top rung, so to speak, administrating all these pieces together. So starting to say that, I was pointing out that what we have is yeah, so we've started. If you're watching, I guess you know we've started, or you know we haven't. So what we have here is conferences. Presently in the church manual, a conference can create speaker guidelines which which can sort of be used to determine who can speak in a local church or not. That's something I'd like to see adjusted too. I don't know that the conference really should have speaker guidelines. You have many reasons that the conference has much control over what's said already. Do we really need to have that? So what I'm looking at here, but that would be a reform of the church, a change of the church manual for another time. What I'm looking at here, not remove, add it. Let's bring it back. Okay, so I wanted to mention some stuff on page 126. By the way, if you do have any questions, you can, if you're on the YouTube feed, you can type them in, and I'll try to give the answers for those. Yeah, let's show any ones that come in. All right. So yeah, so let's carry on then here with the page 126. So here's what we have presently in the present manual. Only speakers worthy of confidence will be invited to the pulpit by the local church pastor. So you can see the pastor has a lot of say over who preaches. In harmony with guidelines given by the conference. Now, in my conference, Michigan conference, it so happens that, and I'm not here really to talk particular about Michigan, but I could give it as an example in certain respects. This conference has no speaking guidelines. We don't have any, the conference has not put any commands to us about things we can and can't say. We should be giving the third angel's message. We should be presenting it from the scriptures and presenting it the beliefs that we have accepted as a church that are the true things. So so when we put someone in the pulpit, that's not really an item for us because we don't have any conference guidelines. But usually the pastor selects the speakers. Sometimes the church board, if you have a guest speaker coming in, I always run my guest speakers past the church board. Pastors come and go, the church board remain, the church members remain. And so every local church should make determinations on this. So local elders or the church board may also invite speakers in consultation with the pastor. Now, I want you to notice, by the way, if you're a church, that this is the current church manual, this would apply for you. So yes, your pastor or your board of elders or your church board, those can all potentially invite guest speakers, guest presenters. And I want you to notice here, it says in consultation with the pastor. It does not say in agreement with the pastor. Now, sometimes they might want to bring in somebody that the pastor doesn't want to bring in, or maybe the conference officials wouldn't come in or don't want them to come in. But here it says that it's really a decision of the local church. The pastor or the elders or the local church decided. It doesn't say you have to agree with the pastor. If the pastor says, no, absolutely not, we're not bringing that person to speak. If the church board outvotes the pastor, guess what? That person's coming to speak. That's the way it works. The pastor, I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor 30 plus years. I can tell you, my wife can tell you, my kids can tell you, pastors, not infallible. We make mistakes. We're human like everybody else is, And so hopefully, we're really tuned into God. Hopefully we have great insight because we've been walking with Jesus so many years and all that. So hopefully we do. But that doesn't mean that our decisions are perfect. It doesn't mean that your conference president's decision or your conference ministerial director decision are all that they could be. So we're human, we make mistakes, and so we're not given absolute power. So when the constituency meets together, they appoint certain people to run, to administrate a conference. So you have a conference president, a conference secretary, a conference treasurer. Those are the top three. Maybe the education leader, because your conference runs church schools. So you'll have maybe four main top administrators, and then you have a staff of pastors, and you have an executive committee that works with the president, and they make decisions. They're like the church board for the conference. It's kind of how things work here. So anyway, I want you to notice here, you don't have to agree with the pastor, and sometimes we don't agree with our pastors. So that's how you make a preaching assignment. You invite speakers, and you try to work with people. Pastor and church board should try to work together. The people who have gone out and are teaching some weirdness, of course, you're not going to want to put them in the pulpit. So yeah, we want to, people who are under discipline are not allowed to speak. Now that's the first of the two slides. Let me give you the rest of page 126, and I see a question or two coming in. I'll come back. I'll look at that in a minute. So the rest of page 126, at times it's acceptable for government officials or civic leaders to address a congregation, but basically nobody else. So this rule on page 126 is not up for consideration presently. The change on page 35 is, but if we change 35 and we take that out and we leave 126, we're leaving basically everything from 35 in there, and some will use this in a way to sort of give more power to the pastor. The pastor can say, we can't have that speaker. And I'm telling you, the local church is the last word. The local church in business meeting has the last word, not the board meeting, not the pastor. Of course, try to work together with people, but let's be careful that we are trying to work together. And also in the church manual, it also tells us that the church board is charged with responsibilities for the spiritual nurture of the church and all that. So it's very much in the bailiwick. It's very much in the space that the church board has been delegated authority and responsibility for a local church board or the church in business to bring in guest speakers. So don't be beholden only to the pastor. Now here's a question that came in here. Where is it here? A local church is stopping some church members from speaking because they're supporting SDA Pearl. We've done a few podcasts here and basically advocated for the SDA Pearl program, which is it takes certain statements that the global churches have been made on behalf of the global Seventh-day Adventist Church that many of us do not believe in. They don't represent our belief. They weren't voted on in a GC session, and they really shouldn't have any kind of authority. And many churches have voted, 70 or more churches have voted to say, we disagree with those, we disapprove of those, our local church doesn't go by those. And that's probably, I'm certain, what Gloria is referring to here as SDA Pearl. It's not a full sentence here, but I think what you're saying, sister, is maybe that a local church is trying to stop some members from maybe preaching or teaching in Sabbath school or whatever it is because they're supporting the Pearl program. That could be happening somewhere, but it shouldn't be happening. Do you know what? When you join the church, you don't check your brain at the door. When you join the church, you don't become it's not that you suddenly give up your right to your opinions. Now that I'm a member, I have to go by what the conference president thinks. That's not the way it is. It's not the way it is. And that's fine. So we should give each member should have the opportunity to have different viewpoints. So I want to kind of bump out from this. Well, I guess the key point I wanted to say is this. If the language on page 35 of the church manual is changed, and we probably should go into more depth on some of this when I'll bring in some guests about why, but let's just say why. If we're going to change it on 35, we should change it on 126. And I believe we should remove or dramatically change the language on those pages so that the local church is not stuck with some kind of dictatorial plan. Now I started to mention that, let's bring this back here. We're looking at some of this business here. I started to mention that certain cases have come up where, let's do this way. where speakers have been banned. And presently, a conference can ban speakers, but there really isn't a very good judicial plan. Like, if you're a banned speaker, like, how do you clear your name? There's not really a good process for that. So once you get kind of skunked, you're just kind of in big trouble. So that's not fair process, whereas Jesus' gospel is, of course, completely fair. So yeah, so Sister Feather is saying that in a certain location, perhaps in Australia, that some of the members have been prevented from holding church office by the pastor, maybe because they're in favor of the church SDA Pearl movement thing, and that shouldn't be at all. Only people who have demonstrated a complete disregard for church authority, complete disregard for um, the proper teachings of the church, and certainly the SDA Pearl movement does not constitute any problem there. I'm for it. I want to see those statements removed. That's a whole nother topic. Again, go back if you want to look at the archives here. You'll find out, look at some of our presentations with Sister De Bruyne. She does a great job for us here from time to time. And we could probably meet with her again here as we come up toward GC session. So yeah, that shouldn't be happening, Gloria. And that's a sad piece. And this is kind of why I'm doing this podcast today. I'm looking at potential abuses of power, and I want to give some insight that might help us not see as much abuse of power. Wherever there's humans involved, you will see challenge of abuse of power. So let's look at, so why should not, well, picking up here. Some unions have begun to ban certain presenters. And yet the church manual nowhere gives them that authority. The church manual limits this. Basically, it's the local church's decision. Yes, presently a conference can ban a speaker, but unions, divisions are not generally, have not been granted authority to ban some person arbitrarily or for whatever reason they want to give. So that shouldn't be happening. So again, we're looking at separation of powers and sort of the basis behind this and some of the pieces on this. So let me go back here and share some business here. Let me point out this, and then I'll go to the Kentucky resolutions and things. But this is just a couple of things here, but a church conference has a lot of power, without the language that's on page 126 or page 35. The church conference already has a lot of power. The conference administration, determines who gets ordained. It may be 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, sometimes even longer before somebody's approved for ordination. And that is decided by a local conference, and then they submit that to the union, and the union will usually approve it. But anyway, the conference has an enormous amount of determining what is said in the pulpit, how, because the pastors are the main speakers. Not they don't speak every Sabbath. You have so many churches and so many pastors, and you have elders, and elders should be people who can speak when the pastor's not there. And so, unless you have one church with one pastor, the pastor's on a circuit. Like I've got a small circuit. I have 2 churches, so I'm not. Sometimes I double preach, and sometimes I preach only at the one church, and my elders preach, and they do a fantastic job when I'm not there, and I trust them. So, so then we have conference administration. Guess what? If they don't want me to preach in their conference, they can hire me or they can fire me. Or they can assign me to a different location if they feel like I'm in a bad mix with that local church. So the conference has enormous power over the staff, the pastors that it hires. So again, we don't really have to have the language on page 126. We don't have to have special speaker guidelines. Before a person has been ordained or hired, and so on, the conference already has been able to do a lot of sorting. So there's a great danger that we'll limit the work of the Holy Spirit if we put in all these rules. The conference administration decides, who's the speakers at camp meeting, who are the ones who come to conference sponsored meetings, right? So there's all kinds of ways that the conference has power to determine, to shape the message that goes into the pulpit, for better or for worse. We don't need the language on page 126 for that. We don't need the language on page 35. So I say scrap that language, take it away. We don't need it. Be wise and careful. We don't need to go back and study it for 5 years and bring it back in 2030. We need to get rid of this language now, because it's been abused many times. It's been abused for some godly presenters. Pastor Stephen Bohr, for one, has been arbitrarily blocked out. Sometimes Pastor Doug Batchelor has been arbitrarily locked out from speaking in a certain state conference, and probably more than one. The conference administration gets to decide who the delegates to the GC session are in certain respects. They get a small number, and that's decided. So the language on page 126 of the church manual, on page 35, it does not, it's not needed. The conference has enormous ways, far beyond what I've put here, to determine what is presented. So let me expand this here a little bit more. And let's go over here. We talked about segmented hierarchy. Okay, here's a little bit of history. So yeah, let's go over here for a minute. So do you know, go back to the beginning of the United States of America, and our first president, George Washington. Second president was John Adams, and our third president was Thomas Jefferson. It's widely known that the primary author of the Declaration of Independence and different things like that, Thomas Jefferson, was a key author of these major foundational documents in the United States that our government is founded on, that separate the powers out. So what is less widely known is that after George Washington, John Adams became the president, we began to get into our first political parties, and there came a kind of a split between the party represented by John Adams and the party represented by Thomas Jefferson. Now, back in those days, there's a lot of things that were different. For example, the nation elected the president, and then the person who got the second most votes became the vice president. This meant that in John Adams' administration, that he became the president, and Thomas Jefferson, who he was running against, if I'm getting my history right here, he became the vice president. And so you have people from different viewpoints, very different viewpoints going on. So there were some issues there going on with potential war with France, and without going into all the pieces, there was the XYZ controversy. You can find all this on Wikipedia. And there was a concern that America would be going to war with France because there were people were being impressed into the military, the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy. They would come and stop at a ship, and they would take the sailors off, and they would say, "You're part of the Royal Navy now." And they basically were forced into labor as Navy, the British Navy. So this became an issue, and we thought we might be going to war with France. And we also had this division between these two sort of different viewpoints. One was what's called a federalist viewpoint. That was John Adams, that was the president. And they were concerned that all the press was chattering and writing things they didn't like. So they passed the Seditions Act and the Aliens Act, and there's about 4 different laws they passed. And meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson and his people were very, very concerned because these things were limiting freedom of speech. And so let me put it on the screen. You'll be surprised maybe about some of the things that were going on there. Now, this relates to the church in terms of separation of powers, because we have a similar model there. This Seditions Act of 1798 prevented any person from writing, printing, uttering, publishing, any kind of, basically anything that said something that the president didn't like. And it seems to us today like dramatically, how could they have even thought that way? The First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, But they were looking at this, and they actually prosecuted 11 people under this. Grandson or something of Benjamin Franklin was one that got put in prison for it and fined. And people from basically Thomas Jefferson's party were kind of put under this ban. So basically, if you said anything against the United States government, you could go to prison. This did not sit well with Thomas Jefferson, and we have the Kentucky resolutions of 1798. Kentucky and Virginia wrote these extensive their Congress passed these resolutions. Now, this was written originally by Thomas Jefferson, so who, of course, is the key author for so many American documents. So I don't know if I want to read the whole thing here to you, but well, let's go at it here. So this is about basically we don't want to have the Alien Seditions Act. We don't believe that's correct. And so the state of Kentucky wanted to limit federal power and wanted the other states to come up and say, hey, this law that's passed, which was passed, I think, 44 to 41 in the United States Congress at the beginning, these Aliens and Seditions Act, just barely passed, and it was very controversial. And there was a lot of trouble that came from this, a lot of friction. So let's see what he says. And again, this is the exact language of 1798, so it's going to be a little wordy here, but let's go. And I'm just looking at the ninth clause. So the state of Kentucky said this in 1798 to the other states and to the federal government. Resolved, lastly, that the governor of this Commonwealth, that's Kentucky, be and is hereby authorized and requested to communicate the preceding resolutions to the legislatures of the several states to assure them that this Commonwealth considers union for specified national purposes, and particularly for those specified in their late federal compact, to be friendly to the peace, happiness, and prosperity of all the states. In other words, what they're saying here is the United States Constitution, the Union for Specified National Purposes, that's the United States Constitution. The federal compact in this statement is the United States Constitution. So we are agreed, we all signed on to the United States Constitution, okay, that's what they're saying. We think it's good, we're for it, that faithful to that compact, the United States Constitution, according to the plain intent and meaning in which it was understood and acceded to by the several parties, so we all agreed to this Constitution, it is sincerely anxious for the state of Kentucky is sincerely anxious for its preservation. We're pro-Constitution here. And the state of Kentucky, it does also believe that to take from the states all the powers of self-government and transfer them to a general and consolidated government without regard to the special delegations and reservations solemnly agreed to in that compact is not for the peace, happiness, or prosperity of these states, and that therefore this Commonwealth, Kentucky, is determined, as it doubts not its co-states are, we think we're all agreeing here, faithfully to submit to undelegated and consequently unlimited powers in no man. In other words, we will not consent, we will not submit, or any body of men on earth. We agreed to the Constitution with limited powers, okay? That's what's going on here. We agreed to the Constitution with limited powers. You now, by passing the Seditions Act, have gone far beyond those powers, and we are not okay with that. We're not going to be okay with that. So they're telling them, and they're trying to gather the other states to say, we can't go with this. This is, certain powers were delegated to the government. Those powers, fine, we're for that, but some powers were not delegated, and we are not okay with people just grabbing powers that we haven't given them, all right? So this is kind of where it's going. Let's go back here, and it's such fine print here. Let me cover the whole screen with it here, okay? So we are determined basically not to submit to the use of unlimited powers in any person, okay? That's the green print here. Let's keep going. That is that if the acts before specified should stand, and there's 8 pieces before this, right, that talk about the some particular pieces about the Alien and Seditions Act of 1798. If the acts specified before should stand, these conclusions would flow from them. That, and here's what they're saying, if you allow this law that you've signed into power to stand, then this is kind of what you're getting. So here's what they're saying. That the general government may place any act they think proper on the list of crimes and punish it themselves, whether enumerated or not enumerated by the Constitution, as cognizable by them. that they may transfer all the powers of the states to themselves without regard to the limitations of the Constitution, that the states would be under the absolute and unlimited control of the general government as to all powers not expressly delegated, and that this would subvert the rights of the states and consolidate all power in the general government. And so that's what they're worried about, is that basically if you can do this, which they passed a law, then basically you can do whatever you want. You could take all of the powers that belong to the states and take all those away. And they were not okay with that. So this is a giant constitutional issue, separation of powers. And so that's what's going on here. All right, let's keep reading. You're going to find this famous quote here. That this Commonwealth does, therefore, enter its solemn protest against said acts. And let's get rid of that. Okay. Let's see. Your Commonwealth does, therefore, enter its solemn protest against said acts, and particularly against the power assumed by the said act concerning aliens, and against the power assumed by said act for the punishment of certain crimes, is unwarranted by the Constitution and dangerous to the liberties of the people. That in questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. So this is Kentucky saying that the Constitution, the system of governance that we've sorted out, that is to limit powers. It separates powers. It limits powers. And I'm saying to you that the church manual is, in many respects, functions similarly, for better or worse, but it functions similarly to that. It separates, it gives certain powers and clarifies certain powers that the local congregation has, certain powers that the local congregation doesn't have, certain authorities that your conference president has, certain authorities that your conference president doesn't have, certain authorities that your pastor has, certain authorities that your pastor doesn't have. So the church manual is, it's not the Constitution, but it functions in terms of separating powers. Okay, so it's constitutionalistic in a sense. And for church members, this is kind of, for better or worse, this is what we have. This is not a bad thing. Yes, it can be abused. Anything can be abused. That doesn't mean that you don't have a rule. Yeah, you can abuse the traffic laws. Does that mean we all just start driving on the left and right side of the road as we willy-nilly feel we should? No, it means, here in America, we'll drive on the correct side of the road, which is the right side. You guys in other countries, you're silly. Anyway, I'm being silly. So what I'm saying to you is that we have certain things we agree on that separate powers, that make things flow functionally, and certain things that guard the rights of people. And so, yeah, what we're looking at is the fact that the church has in it a separation of powers, and it should continue to have a separation of powers. So let's go back here to this, finish this statement here. But this is that famous statement we had where this is written by Thomas Jefferson. Did I say that? Thomas Jefferson basically is the author of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. So this is Thomas Jefferson's famous saying, in questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. So then they go on to say, this Commonwealth, so Kentucky, does therefore call on its co-states for an expression of their sentiments on the acts concerning aliens and for the punishment of certain crimes, plainly declaring whether these acts are or are not authorized by the federal compact, that is, by the Constitution. And it doubts not that their sense will be so announced as to continue the attachment to limited government according to the true sense of the Constitution, and preserve to the states the powers not delegated to the United States. So you have the states, you have the United States, and so, yeah, what you have then is separation of powers. Certain obligations the government has to its people, certain obligations the state has to its people, and the things that are not under the 10th Amendment of the United States, the powers that are not delegated to the federal government are retained by the states, and or the people, because some powers have not been given by the people even to the states. So those powers remain with the people. So I know the United States government is not the same as the church organization. Okay, I know that. But what I'm telling you is the principles are very similar, right? There is a separation of powers. Within the church, there is a separation of powers. You do not want a papal system. You do not want a system where whatever the General Conference president says, he can call up and say, hey, I don't like Larry's haircut, fire him. You don't want that. You don't want a situation where people can say, hey, this guy's teaching something heretical. We've never heard it before. Without any kind of process, just throw him out of the church. There should be a fair process all along the way. So yeah, what we want to do is we want to be right. We want to work together, and the church manual, for all of its human imperfections, the church manual gives us some help with that. Now, actually, this Kentucky resolutions, it was actually passed. That's what I have on the screen here. What's interesting, too, is if you go back, there was a draft of this before this time, and a portion of this, much of it was similar, but there's a portion of this that the language was changed in what was finally voted, and that's fine. But it's interesting to see what Thomas Jefferson wrote, before he wrote the chains, no, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution. By the way, what I'm saying is bind the church leaders down for mischief by the chains of the church manual. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Not that they intend mischief, but we're humans, so we can create problems without meaning to. But anyway, what Thomas Jefferson wrote before they had that wording, which is good wording, but this is interesting still. You can see some of the same language here, but let me read it out in green, because he had another solution called nullification. And that is a useful piece for us to have an awareness of here too. So therefore, this Commonwealth, Kentucky, is determined, as it doubts not its co-states are, to submit to undelegated and consequently unlimited powers in no man or body of men on the earth. We're not going to submit. We're determined not to submit. And then they say this, that in cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated. So the first part is, if there's an abuse of powers that were delegated, then getting rid of those people, impeaching, removing, changing them out, electing different people, that would be the constitutional solution, right? Changing your church officers, changing your conference president, changing your general conference president, whatever it is, if you have powers that have been delegated, but then they're abused. Now he goes on to say, though, but what about powers that were not delegated, powers that were never supposed to be used? So this was Thomas Jefferson, what he wrote before they actually passed it with different wording. He says this, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy, that every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact, in other words, not according to the Constitution, to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits, that without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. So what is he saying? He's saying that when you have a exercise of power that is not delegated, that the proper thing to do is to say, we disregard that, we nullify. That within the boundaries of the state of Kentucky, we refuse to recognize the authority of the federal government to pass the Seditions Act because it goes against the very Constitution that we agreed to. Now, what's interesting about because our sister was mentioning before, the federal government, we're talking before about the Pearl program, right, in the church, where we have this movement that has begun, I think, in Australia and has gone to most different countries. We have churches who have voted to disregard these certain decisions. And this isn't really quite my topic today, but it sort of bears upon it with this nullification piece, right? The SDA Pearl plan basically is a nullification. I don't think they've used that language. I'm not sure they want me to prefer that language, but it's basically a nullification. What they're saying is, and I think they're correct, the church authorities that have created some of these statements have done so without the proper authority from the church. So this is undelegated authorities. Now they'll say we have properly delegated authority to make these statements. Many in the church are saying, no, you don't. This is not voted by a general conference in session. Our statements of belief should be voted by the general conference in session. And in effect, these other statements, while they're not statements of belief on the regular list, they are statements of belief. They're interpreted by people outside our polity, people who don't know how the church is organized. They're interpreted and understood by them to be actual statements of Seventh-day Adventist belief, that we have a certain viewpoint on global warming together. We have a certain viewpoint on vaccination together, and so it goes. In fact, these statements do not come, in my understanding, they are not authorized by the compact, by the Constitution, by the church manual, the working policy, and all that. Those powers have not been given to our authorities to make those statements, and therefore those statements are nullified. So when a church passes the Pearl program, you are basically saying, you're telling them, we don't recognize your authority. We've never delegated this authority to you to pass this. And in our local church congregation, we vote in business meeting that we reject the 2015 statement. We reject the 2021 statement. We kind of have here basically a local negation or nullification, because the statements that have come, they were not ever truly delegated. That was not ever understood to be the authorities delegated to you. So the Pearl program can be understood as a program of sort of nullification. And you can see in the language here of Thomas Jefferson, right, that his original plan was not to send it to the Supreme Court, not to make it a point of legal razzmatazz back and forth, but just to say, well, in our conference, that doesn't count. In our local church, that doesn't count. In our state, we refuse to recognize the Alien and Seditions Acts. So that was nullification. But again, that language was changed to this language, which is not quite as strong, but it does say this in questions of power, that no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. And so today, I would say to you, the church manual, not the Constitution, not written by Thomas Jefferson, might be good if it was, but anyway, it is what we have. We agree to it. And again, as I stated before, it outlines certain obligations the church has towards us, the members, certain responsibilities and rights. The word rights is used 3 times in the church discipline section. So it talks about the rights of members. If you're accused of something, you have certain rights. So this is specifying rights, obligations, how things work, what your conference president can do and what he can't do. For example, the conference president is never authorized to come in and say, well, the church officers you've selected are we don't like them, so they're not in those offices anymore. That's a local church matter, right? Okay. So anyway, we have this business together, and I wanted to sort of bring this before you today. And so, yes, a little bit more from Sister Feather here on the Pearl thing. So whether the Pearl thing will come up at the GC session or not, it's not on the agenda. I was quite certain it would not be on the agenda. I hope that some of the delegates bring it up. In fact, I'm quite certain that somehow it will be brought up. Whether there will be a proper discussion of that at the session remains to be seen. I guess we'll know more in a month or two. In terms of the language, though, that we've talked about here from page 35 and page 126, I believe it's an urgent change to the church manual, that the language on page 35 should, yes, be stricken from the church manual. And I would also say, I would also suggest that the language on page 126 also be very largely modified, if not entirely removed, again, so that the pastor doesn't have absolute authority to say that a guest speaker doesn't come. The conference, no union should have a chance to ban people. That's not even in the church manual as it is today. The union just doesn't have that authority. So again, at the local church level, this is why you have elders. At the local church level, you have a pastor. At the local church level, the members have a say. You have a church board. The local church is quite capable of deciding who's a proper speaker or not for that church. So we don't need to have interlopers from the union or the division coming down and arbitrarily banning whoever the speaker might be, especially if it's an ordained worker or a godly lay person. There's, unless they're teaching crazy, out of the book, crazy heretical pieces, we should not be banning them. And so I don't want to go on further today and labor the point, but I thought it was useful today to look back because I believe that our church governance model, it's largely based, it's similar to the Methodist model. That is largely based, and they're all kind of largely based on the United States Constitution plan, separation of powers. Certain things are segmented hierarchy. There's certain things that this body does. There's certain things that body does. There's certain things that this body does. But the power does not go all the way up, and then the president has this imperial papal type power. That's not the way it works. And in the church, it shouldn't work that way either. And nobody's proposing that in the church it should work that way. But in fact, what we really have, I'm kind of summarizing now today to finish, and then we'll finish. What we have today is the conference administration as the system is presently set up, the church manual as the system is presently set up. The conference leadership has enormous power as it is. I mean, if they don't abuse their power, they have enormous power as it is to determine, to sufficiently control what happens in the pulpit. We need to give the Holy Spirit room, and we need to be very careful. Setting up conference guidelines is it's a backdoor to, do you believe, I mean, go back to the early Adventist church. Do you believe that the Adventists would have ever had a hearing? Would they be allowed to come into churches and teach their viewpoints if there were speaker guidelines that said, okay, we're not going to talk about disputed views on prophecy? Well, that would be the end right there. William Miller wouldn't be allowed to come in, right? Or the different speakers. James White wouldn't be allowed to come and speak on that. So as a church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, trying to finish the Reformation, trying to be right, we want to be careful. We want to not limit the working of the Holy Spirit. We want to have the powers, the authority rests in the membership. And in case anybody forgets where that is, let's see if we can bring it out here for us. I think it's on page 29 or 27. Let's see here. Okay, it's on page 28. Here it is, right here. And always don't forget this. The Seventh-day Adventist form of governance, church governance, is representative, which recognizes that authority rests in the membership and is expressed through duly elected representatives at each level of organization and so forth. So now when you're in the business meeting, you're not sending your power to anybody else, you're voting directly. But in all other cases, where you're electing delegates to a thing, you're sending representatives. Those people are voted so that you have representation indirectly by the people you elect. So we're coming up to the general conference session, and different people that have been elected to be delegates, those people that have been selected to be delegates, they will go and speak on behalf of your local body. And so we want for things to be done properly. We're not talking about a total mob mentality. We're not talking about the local church gets to decide everything. We're just saying that certain things, already are delegated to the union. Certain things are already delegated to the general conference. Certain things are already delegated to the local church, like church discipline. So in the local church level, these things are close to holy. They should not be violated. These would be abuses of power. So be careful with the church manual, because it is kind of like amending the Constitution when you change the church manual. But there are some things, room for reform and correction, adjustment. And so I would say to you, appreciate the church manual. Don't throw it away because you think somebody abused it. Somebody almost certainly has abused it over and over again. But it also outlines obligations the church has towards you. And from that standpoint, you want those obligations to stand. You want the church to treat you rightly so. And when it comes to things like the pearl thing that was mentioned here by some of our comments, people commenting here during the podcast, there are, I'm sure, have been abuses of power against faithful, godly members who are just expressing a different viewpoint. But in effect, their viewpoint is sort of like a nullification because some of that power was never delegated to the GC, and yet it's been used in a way that's been very destructive it's extremely destructive to the unity of the church. And the reason why is because this is sort of violating the separation of powers thing. So let's keep our powers separated. Let's pray for the leaders. And let's not forget that the authority rests in the membership. Let's pray for the membership so that we will select right leaders, and the leaders will respect the things. Another thing, it's not on the list, I know, but we should have conference constituency meetings every 2 years. Every 2 years. I guess I could live with every 3 years. Every 4 years or 5 years apart. Brothers and sisters, the world is changing so rapidly. We cannot put somebody in as a leader and then have them go for 5 years. They dodge one bullet every 5 years, and then they're the union president for 5 more years. We need to have, it'll cost us a little bit more, but the liberty that we'll get back, the good pieces that we'll get back, the accountability that we'll get back from in the church by having more frequent constituency meetings, that will be well worth any money we have to spend more to send more people, more delegates to a meeting. So yeah, that's probably another topic really, but really, absolutely, like the early Adventist church, we should have general conference sessions 2 years apart, 3 years apart, certainly at the local conference constituency level, every 2 or 3 years apart. And that will keep us all good for the can, good for the bottle, as the slogan goes around here. Good for everybody, good for the leadership, good for the membership. So today we've talked a little bit about some changes in the church manual that are proposed and some that aren't proposed. And I propose that delegates of the GC session be smart. Don't let this thing go back to the committee. Do agree to the changes on page 35 in the church manual. Those are good ideas to change. At the same time, somebody should also include changes on page 126 so that you actually have a change, and we are not granting arbitrary authority to people to arbitrarily block speakers. We don't like his haircut, so he can't come. Let's not go there. That's absurd, and it certainly won't finish the Reformation. All right, friends, today, yeah, I know you're probably tired of my face, so we're done here. I just wanted to visit with you a little bit and bring up this church manual item. I think it can be useful, and maybe we've made some points in kind of a scattered way, I admit, today. But interesting, going back to Kentucky and the Kentucky Resolution of 1798, binding down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Friends, there's an opportunity coming in July to bind down from mischief some of the things that have been done by also changing page 126. And if you really get things going, let's change constituency meetings so that they happen every 2 or 3 years, not every 5 years. Come on, this is 2025. I mean, by the time we come to the next GC session, how many iterations of AIs are going to be? How far along will we be with crazy new pieces? Things are changing too fast. The church needs to keep up. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, each person who commented, and I wish well to all people. Our conference leaders here, we want the Lord to bless, have them to do things that are blessable. The Lord to bless them. We want good things in all the conferences, and we certainly want good process. We want to keep our responsibilities as members, and we want the church to keep its obligations to its members. God be with you, and God bless you, and see you next week on Remedial Protestantism podcast.